Truth is stranger than fiction because fiction has to make sense. I'm paraphrasing, here's the full quote. This idea is heavily tied to Lazarus' production. This series eerily mirrors some negative aspects of our current world. I'll be breaking down how Lazarus was made while focusing on these connections. What powers this series more than anything is reality. Story spoilers for episode 1 only. In the year 2049, renowned neuroscientist Dr. Skinner creates a miracle drug called Hapna, capable of relieving any kind of pain, physical and mental. Shortly after its introduction, he disappears completely only to resurface online in the year 2052. Skinner reveals that the drug is actually a slow-acting poison, and due to its popularity, most of humanity is now on a ticking clock. The only hope: find Skinner within 30 days, before the first wave of deaths begin. That mission falls to a team of misfits known as Lazarus. The series was created by Shinichiro Watanabe, best known for Cowboy Bebop. He's got quite the resume with many popular works. Of all the futuristic worlds he's created, Lazarus is the nearest to current day. We're just as close to 2052 as we are to 1998, when Bebop first aired. And that's no accident. Just watching the news and taking a look at the world, things happening right now seem more dramatic and kind of crazier than fiction. Because I was inspired by the events going on in the real world, putting it too far into the future would lose that touch of reality. Watanabe always aims to ground his stories in some form of realism. Lazarus just doubles down on this, even though it's science fiction. Star Wars, for example, doesn't feel alive to him. It doesn't have a sense of being truly lived in. If we're looking at a scene of an empty sidewalk, there has to be cigarette butts or some visible trace of human presence. He also considers laser guns to be an instant loss of reality. Space Dandy is considered an exception because it's comedic. Just take a look at Lazarus' Babylonia City to see what he means. Rich areas like the tower are really clean and modern. The slums, on the other hand, just have drugs spilled across the street. Look at this. Look at that. So real. Speaking of towers in Babylonia, Lazarus begins with a cold open filled with religious imagery. There's a dreidel here. The miracle that was Hapna has stopped spinning. In terms of religious depictions, I wanted to use it as a metaphor for human suffering, and religion is basically a way to cope with human suffering. In Lazarus, I wanted to replace that religion with Hapna, which would remove all the pain from humanity. Watanabe's casts are also a bit more diverse than your typical anime. Probably the biggest influence for that is the movie Blade Runner. It was a melting pot of race and gender. When I watched it in the 80s, I really did believe that the world would become like that. But once that time came, the world was nothing like it. So instead, I created that world in animation. Here's the big, obvious one. One of the main inspirations behind Lazarus is the real-world opioid crisis, and the broader issue of drug abuse. Based on his interview responses, this seems to stem from Watanabe having to watch musicians he's loved die from drug overdoses. This extends into adjacent topics, like wanting to escape reality through harmful habits, and the growing distrust of drug companies and health institutions. It's not an illegal drug, so isn't it strange? Why was this drug approved? Or, if such a drug was intentionally made and distributed, wouldn't it kill a lot of people? No big spoilers, but the series eventually touches on the topics of climate change and artificial intelligence. What I believe is most dangerous right now is AI, and it's not being controlled. That problem figures into episode 6. Watanabe wanted you to have points of relatability and familiarity, so he chose to add pop culture references. The Avengers are mentioned, and SoundCloud and Wikipedia exist. He extends this idea to sound design as well. The Formosa group worked on Lazarus. You may not know them, but you've probably heard them. Even for the sound effects, especially for shooting a gun. I asked Formosa to use actual gunshots, and mix some new sounds to make it sound a little bit different. I wanted some reality, even in the sound effects. And of course, the show takes some inspiration from the COVID pandemic, particularly surrounding how people react in a time of crisis. Lazarus features a nightmarish situation without depicting its response as black or white. The reaction is mixed. All of these kids just go to school like nothing happened. And this guy's the only one to be like, why would I waste my final days here? That was inspired by reality and experiencing the COVID pandemic. Not everyone was acting the same way. There were people who didn't believe in it, and there were people who didn't wear masks. I thought the anime would be more grounded in reality if I made it so we had different reactions from the characters. Watanabe is basically trying to make a world that feels less like a sci-fi fantasy and more like what life could actually be in 2052. But based on what we've discussed so far, such a future seems to be an amplification of the dangers of our current world. The COVID influence is particularly interesting, since Lazarus started development before late 2019. The proposal for this project was actually initiated by Cartoon Network. Jason DeMarco, co-creator of Toonami, is a big fan of Cowboy Bebop. They wanted to fund a new show and give Watanabe complete creative control. The only thing they requested was that it be serious in tone. Apparently it took 10 years to go from proposal to completion. We know that drug abuse is one of the thematic starting points for the series, but the starting point for character writing was parkour. Like most animators, Watanabe likes interesting movements. He was watching parkour one day and found the danger aspect very appealing. Working from that line of thought, I wanted a character who put himself into dangerous situations and became more of a daredevil. I'd also heard that Tom Cruise loves doing dangerous stunts. I wanted to make Axel look like a very young version of Tom Cruise, so the character writing stems from the protagonist and his physicality, someone who thrives on danger because it makes him feel alive. Watanabe usually thinks about characters and story separately. If he can manage to bring them together in the middle of his creative process, then we have a work. He started developing this project with Keiko Nobumoto, a familiar face to many of Watanabe's productions. She sadly passed away in 2021, before the project got really deep into scriptwriting. Despite that, Watanabe believes that any familiar vibe you get between Bebop and Lazarus is simply the result of teaming up with the same person again. Since it was the last show that Keiko worked on, I really want to make a success of it as Lazarus. This brings us to a point that I haven't been ignoring, and is probably impossible to ignore. It's very likely that Lazarus will always be compared to Cowboy Bebop. Watanabe would prefer it if you didn't make this comparison. In no way am I doing the same thing on purpose, making a cameo or paying homage to my previous works. Everything is for a reason, and I want you to watch it with fresh eyes. Don't look for similarities, just enjoy it for what it is. I think he's done a good job in differentiating each work, but due to his unique directing style and personal preferences, it's kind of hard not to compare them a little bit. Bebop was also the biggest factor in getting Chad Stahelski, director of the John Wick films, involved with Lazarus. Watanabe and Stahelski have a deep level of admiration for each other's works. People ask, where do you get the ideas? Where do you get your influences? One of them was always Shinichiro Watanabe-san with Cowboy Bebop and Samurai Champloo. This goes all the way back to when Stahelski was a stuntman for The Matrix. The Wachowskis took a lot of inspiration from Watanabe as well, who'd eventually work on The Animatrix a few years later. Since we're dealing with another sci-fi show set in the future, rehashing Cowboy Bebop was the last thing Watanabe wanted to do, so he contacted Stahelski looking for a way to change up the action. Stahelski jumped at this chance, regardless of costs. If it was for Watanabe, he was gonna do it. So what exactly did he do? Stahelski put together a team consisting of himself, John Wick choreographer Jeremy Marinas, and some of his stuntmen from 8711 Entertainment for this project. Many members of the team were anime fans themselves, and studied anime choreography extensively before getting started. They would receive regular story briefings from Japan, then use those to choreograph and stage the action scenes. They recorded these and sent them back to the animation team. Animators would then study these videos and decide which components could be stylized and translated into anime. Watanabe stresses that this isn't just rotoscoping or motion capture. To truly rival live action, he believes they needed to take the hand-drawn approach, though it took until episode 4 to really get going, which was where the first big collaborative set piece debuted. Due to how early in production episode 1 was, it didn't really get any input from Stahelski's team. The parkour scenes there are the work of animators Hiromitsu Seki and Takeo Oda. Episode 2 and 3 had short action sequences with some involvement from the stunt guys. It's important to note that Watanabe has a lot of faith in his animation team. He knows that they're very particular about action, and he gives individual animators creative control. It's up to them to plan out the movement and speed of a sequence, and he'll only step in if it's lacking in reality or if the pacing is off. Careful attention to detail may contribute to the anime's longer than average production cycle. Episode 5, for instance, has a certain fight scene in a moving elevator. The animator leading that scene spent half a year on it. It's interesting to see that in Stahelski's mind, one of anime's biggest strengths is how it isn't limited by reality. You could do so much. That's the thing with anime. You want me to run on a monorail on drones? Of course. Anime is incredible. You can get away with stuff we can't do practically. We'll do things that give the animators a sense of things, and then they have to dial it back to make it look great. But then Watanabe is trying to ground Lazarus in reality. In a way, I think both sides got what they were looking for. Since the fight scenes are often based on real people performing those actions, there is a unique sense of realism to this movement. However, Stahelski's action often feels like anime. His stylized combat that emphasizes readability takes inspiration from the medium after all. Watanabe really came to the right place when looking for someone to collab with. The final piece of Lazarus's origins is a core part of Watanabe's works: music. The title of this show shares the same name as the end credits song, which is Lazarus by the Boo Radleys. When I was thinking about the content of Lazarus, I had vague ideas like the opioid problem, parkour, but then I thought, I'm going to die. In parkour, if you take the wrong step, you'll fall and die. You might lose your life by the skin of your teeth. All these elements were jumbling together, and then I heard this song. Watanabe credits this piece of music as a major inspiration for the series. It reminded him of a story from the Bible, the raising of Lazarus, which likely sparked the show's religious themes. The rest of Lazarus's music comes from his desire to explore a new sound, something different from his past works, and better aligned with his recent interests. He brought on 3 artists who've never worked on soundtracks before. World-famous American saxophonist Kamasi Washington, who also did Lazarus's opening, British trip-hop jazz musician Bonobo, and British electronic producer Floating Points. Watanabe told them not to approach it as if composing a soundtrack. Instead, he wanted them to create music as if they were making it for their own albums. He also mentioned that Washington in particular is a big fan of his past works. There really is no avoiding bebop. Lazarus's production is deeply tied to its legacy. We've got a more modern jazzy electronic sound this time, as opposed to the older jazz sound of that other show. Like most Japanese creators, Watanabe wants you to take away your own message from Lazarus, but he would like it if you seriously thought about whether Skinner was right to do what he did. At the time I'm making this, Lazarus isn't finished. If it all went according to plan, the final 5 episodes should have felt different from the first 8. Watanabe took particular pride in the emotional impact of that 8th one. With that being said, and considering anything new you might have learned, how are we feeling about Lazarus so far? Or as a whole if it's finished? Doomed to be mid, or a highlight of the year?